The Drake Group Education Fund is dedicated to educating the public and professionals in our business with fact-based information, featuring the experts in our profession, so that we might all do a better job of helping college athletes realize the promise of an educational degree and becoming all they can be as students and athletes and the athletics administrators who are managing these programs. So we welcome you to our 44th webinar. Thanks to all of our panelists for their time, expertise, and ideas, and to all of you for attending. Webinars provide us with the opportunity to share new ideas, recalibrate our thinking on issues, and get up to date on important topics. So we're pleased to have you join us. Before you meet our moderator and panelists, I just want to emphasize our speakers are expressing their own opinions, not the opinions of the organizations in which they are employed or are members, unless they make that distinction in their remarks. Now, I'm honored to introduce the moderator of today's program. Please meet Erin Miller, educator, author, podcaster, career coach, cultural consultant, and member of the Drake Group Board of Directors, and our esteemed panelists to address this critically important topic of reported increases in college athlete suicide and other mental health risks.
Thank you so much, Julie. And when you registered for this webinar, you received biographies of our panelists today, but let me thank and briefly acknowledge each panelist before I begin. First, we have Catherine Beach, National Program Manager for Courage First Athlete Helpline. Thank you. We have Dr. Rick Eckstein, Professor of Sociology at Villanova University. Thank you. Danielle Saragusa, LCSW Executive Director of the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline. Thank you. Katie Steele, Executive Director of the Athletes Mental Health Foundation. Thank you. And Kenyatta Walker, Associate Director of the Cox Communication Academic Center for Student Athletes at the Louisiana State University. Thank you. Now, before I begin to ask our panelists to share their expertise, let me briefly frame this sobering topic and give it some context. While we're discussing athlete mental health today, particularly at the college level, many researchers have been reporting declines in youth mental health for some time. As one licensed clinical psychologist recently put it, quote, "We were already seeing a decline in mental health before the pandemic. Then the pandemic fast-forwarded what was already an existing trend around the mental health of kids and teens." According to one study in 2021 called the Healthy Minds Study, more than 60% of college students met the criteria for at least one mental health problem. And 8 years before that, in 2013, that figure was just 30%. Now, these trends in mental health have worsened among all racial and ethnic groups. However, these struggles are not felt the same nor responded to in the same way by everyone. And although ethnic minority students experience mental health symptoms at a similarly higher rates as white students, minority students are less likely to access mental health treatment. And scholarly literature has consistently found that Asian students have the lowest rates of treatment uptake. If all of this wasn't bad enough, mental health problems during college are predictive of lower academic success, and depression is associated with a twofold increase in risk in dropping out or stopping out of college without graduation. So what about college athletes? That's why we're here today. Are they a unique part of the college population, or do their struggles mirror the ones mentioned above? Today, our distinguished panel of experts will explore the multifaceted landscape of athlete mental health, diving into critical issues such as the balance between confidentiality and support, the stigma of seeking help, and the unique experiences of athletes of color at predominantly white institutions. So with all that in mind, I'd like to ask all of you to reflect on a range of interrelated topics such as systemic solutions, including improved hotline processes, strategies to alleviate academic pressures and athletic pressures, and addressing the developmental challenges associated with college athletics. So let's start with a deeper discussion of the problems that we face in college sports around mental health. What are some of the pressures that college athletes face today? This is an open question for any panelist who'd like to begin.
Well, I guess I can start out, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
From my lens, I would say a lot of their pressures are academically centered, whether they're passing their courses to be eligible, this new space of NIL, combating, am I getting this amount? Am I worth this amount of money? Those are, for me, probably the most that I've experienced thus far, that are like top tier with our student athletes and those pressures.
Thank you, Kenyatta. Anybody else like to chime in there?
I think the thing I would add too is the internal value. I wrote with a few people the book, The Price She Pays, and through our interviews, there's this conveyor belt system that can make it really hard for athletes to be able to tether to their internal worth, and instead using all these external markers to prove their worth instead of knowing their worth. And that can be really tricky when you're trying to achieve, and that's important. And we don't want to soften that within sport. And who are you beyond your sport, so that you also have a place to come back to that can fuel your passion, hopefully, to continue to help you excel in sport. But that when seasons go south, or there's an injury or a coaching change, you also have an anchor point.
Thank you, Katie.
I'll jump on that identity issue that Katie mentioned, because one of the things we're finding now in our research for the documentary we're working on is how oftentimes college sports, just because of its regimentation, it just strips people of their identity and replaces a personal identity, a sense of worth, Katie, with the team, the group, the school. So even if something doesn't go wrong, and occasionally it does with an injury or losing a spot on the team, if that's all you have, if your self-worth is completely tied to the sport because of its demands and because it acts very much like what we call a total institution, it just regiments your life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There is a disjunction there, and it gets tough sometimes to find your way back when the expectations are so strong and so much out of your control. That's what the athletes keep expressing to us, is how little control they have over their time, over their day, over who they are.
Thank you very much, Rick. And so what mental health issues do you all see predominating in your work? What are the specific things that people come to you with?
I would say for me and with my private practice in general, I would say the top presenting issue is anxiety. And so the anxiety around performance, the anxiety around living into those expectations of others, the anxiety around the identity piece that we were just talking about. Who am I? Some individuals who have maybe lost the passion for the sport, but feel the pressure around maintaining the facade of I'm this elite athlete and all of the praise and accolades that I've received. What does it mean? And who am I if I don't have them? And who am I disappointing if I walk away from them? And so the many layers of anxiety are the number one presenting issue that I would say I see across clients.
Thank you. I see a few of our other panelists nodding to that. Would anybody like to add there?
I can add on there. So if you're not familiar with the athlete helpline that I run, the Courage First Athlete Helpline is a confidential call, text, chat number that athletes, parents, coaches, anyone can reach out to. And when we pull the data from the calls and from the help seekers, I see similar anxiety related issues, just like Danielle touched on. But there's kind of the added component of that the help seekers who reach out are often calling because they don't know who to go to. So that's another layer, right? They're calling this confidential line because they don't know, or they don't feel comfortable going to their school, going to their coach, going to whatever counseling center they might have. And that is an additional pressure, or they're feeling the pressure of the unknown of reaching out at their school. Is this going to get me in trouble? Is there going to be retaliation? Is this going to put my scholarship at risk? Are my teammates going to be very upset with me? So we have the mental health struggle. And then on top of it, where do I get help? That's an additional stressor.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, that leads into another question I intended to ask today, which is, I understand there are different folks in athletic departments and in the broader university that athletes are able to reach out to, but not all of those roles are created equal, and they have different reporting structures. And so I wonder if someone could speak to those distinctions between, let's say, sports psychologists or licensed clinical social workers and anybody else who athletes might reach out to, in addition to the hotline that you run, Catherine.
Typically, I see my student athletes, just depending, of course, on the institution and their comfortability with their sports science area within athletics. It just depends, but I do see a lot of them do reach out to the internal resources. But you do have some that are just not comfortable. They're fearful of, hey, you're gonna go tell the coach, and that may impede upon my draft stock or me being able to play professionally because you're, sharing this information with others. So typically within the structures that I've been a part of, it has been mostly internally, but I have had some instances where students didn't trust. So we had to kind of bridge the gap with them to figure out something externally.
Thank you, Kenyatta. Katie?
Yeah, the other thing I'd piggyback on that is that the access is hard. So even if you're at a big school that has the resources and internal systems, which is amazing, those spots fill up really fast and are often given to the star athletes. So what happens if you're on not a dominant sport like basketball or football team and you do track and cross country? Where is your spot kind of in the pecking order of even getting access to the internal offerings? If your department your athletic department even has one, that can be really tricky of navigating that system. And I'll say, as somebody who's in outpatient mental health in a small town, it's a tricky system to navigate under the best of circumstances anyway, right? Is this a problem? Does it warrant me reaching out to somebody? It doesn't seem like it's that bad. And similar to what Danielle is saying is we want the early intervention. We want people reaching out when I have some anxiety around my competition or contemplating if I like this or not, right? The earlier we can get intervention, the better, but finding that spot of intervention can be really hard. So we oftentimes then see folks clinically when there's self-harm or there's an eating disorder, or there's something really acute, and then that makes it really complex. So early intervention, the more we can make it clear for athletes where they go and what the order of operations is, the better. Similar to what we do if somebody gets an ACL tear, right? They know their order of operations and how their recovery and healing is supposed to look. Hopefully we can create those same systems for athletes.
Yeah, really good point. I mean, we're talking in many cases about invisible mental health challenges as opposed to physical challenges which will be visible. And so we're all speaking a lot here about the different barriers that athletes face in utilizing either campus or off-campus health centers and mental health resources. Are there others that also should be mentioned?
Well, as part of that though, Aaron, just the sheer numbers of athletes who are going to require some sort of intervention, even if it's a minor stage or, as Katie was saying, at more major stages, there aren't enough, right? There's no way unless you just do one-offs with people. And I know we've talked to athletes who say, well, we have a quota, we can talk to a therapist once during the semester, and then it's someone else's turn because there are 600 athletes and maybe 2 or 3 or 4 licensed therapists as opposed to sports psychologists who are working on performance. So just that the sheer number, if the numbers if the amount of stress and anxiety is what we think it is, it's almost impossible to serve that capacity with what even exists on the planet. I mean, just imagine how many professionals you would need to really deal with that on a weekly basis, because a one-off therapy session is not really, I'm not a therapist, but I would imagine it's not very useful.
And I do want to add one thing that I have noticed a lot of athletic departments are trying to do to kind of bridge that gap, break the stigma of mental health. It's kind of normalizing a little bit, bringing in technology as an aspect for students to check in, just to gauge how they're feeling, how they're doing. So that has been really growing in our field. On the campus side of things, to kind of say, okay, this is real. So let us try to do some things that we can normalize it to make it a lot easier for the student athletes to come and have conversations. For smaller institutions or limited resource institutions, I think there's been a lot of training with the coaches so that they can recognize certain signs and things before they become detrimental to the student or the program, that they can kind of refer in a way as well. So I just wanted to add those two things, that
Yes, thank you.
departments are addressing the need. But as Rick alluded to, if we really took hold of this whole mental health aspect, we're going to have a lot more professionals and, well, not enough professionals to meet the needs in our departments.
Can I follow up there too about the stigma and normalizing the seeking mental health resources? What do you feel like has worked for you or for institutions that you've been a part of to help do that?
The more students see that it's okay to really authentically express who they are and they don't have negative ramifications for it, the more they're prone to say, hey, I'm okay with disclosing this. A lot of times we've seen it manifest through substance abuse. So having to address, those issues as well. But I will say just being able to have people around them that don't necessarily judge them and knowing that the space that you have is going to be confidential and nobody else will know, gives them that feeling of it's okay. And then that again breaks down those additional barriers. And also knowing the student, like a lot of our male students won't necessarily want to have a male therapist. So just understanding the dynamics of the students and being able to partner them with someone and letting them know that someone is always there for them if they need the assistance.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up confidentiality, another important topic we need to discuss here. What can somebody speak to the rules that exist in terms of confidentiality, whether it's on campus or off campus, when there's an engagement or an intervention?
I can speak to confidentiality in terms of some of you all on campuses jump in because you're going to know way better. Clinically, and this is when we were interviewing coaches and athletes, learned some of the breakdown of where this happens. So somebody comes in for an outpatient session, which would be either through their athletic department, hopefully some kind of a licensed clinician, or they're going off campus. Either way, confidentiality is protected, right? And we say this at the beginning of every session. What you say here remains confidential unless you're a threat to harm yourself, others, elderly, or children. And where that what we have heard, so you all chime in if you have a different experience with athletes, is there for athletes it can be frustrating of they've heard things, the clinician saying something about their teammate, or where that isn't always protected, and where's the line of what's going to get relayed and what's not. And then coaches shared with us, it's really confusing though, because the athlete goes and then it's like they've basically gone into this like silo where we don't get any information. So they went to treatment because they were having suicidal ideation, and then we aren't sure what's happening and what to be doing to help support their mental health. So I think my understanding and my perception is that this is where we actually need to be doing some work in terms of how can we be making more of this team approach, not that content is necessarily disclosed so that the athlete can feel as though they have this protected space to do really good, solid mental health work. However, that there is continuity with the program so that it isn't either shameful or that there's something being missed if there's an eating disorder or substance use, that if they need other support, then they can be getting that from their program as well. But it's complex and it's nuanced. I'd be curious your all's take of how you're seeing it go really well in programs, because it is tricky.
Thank you, Katie. Kenyatta?
And I agree with Katie. It is very tricky. I think the biggest thing is that training and teaching to our coaches that, yes, we have these sports psychologists. They're here to do a job, and no, you don't need to know everything. You just need to know that the need is being met for that student athlete. And I think the more we have those conversations with coaches, and then also on the back end with the sports psychologists, giving them tools to be able to assist the students as they see certain behaviors manifest themselves. And not that they're diagnosing them, but they're able to relate to them in their sport based off some of the behaviors that they may present.
Thank you, Kenyatta. So, Rick, do you have something you want to add?
Just that it gets even trickier still, right? So imagine the scenario when the source of the athlete's frustration and stress and anxiety is the coach. Now, why would anyone want to tell the coach, or why would the athlete want the coach to know that the source of the stress is some kind of body shaming, perhaps, or verbal abuse, being thrown onto the scale every time? Katie, every time you show up for a race, getting thrown onto the scale. If that's the case, maybe we have to consider getting coaches out of the loop and having something truly independent that the athletes can feel is not going to be reporting back to people who are in the chain of command. That's
Thank
tricky.
you. Yeah, thank you, Rick, for mentioning that. And of course, that, leads into the new world of college sports that we're in because, historically speaking, coaches have had an enormous amount of power, and they still do in many cases. But that's been lessened to some degree with the freer transfer portal, the freedom that the transfer portal allows, and also the relative power that some athletes are getting now in the NIL era and the age of social media. So there's been some reports in the news about college athletes striving really desperately to join this so-called attention economy. And so I wonder, and maybe this is a question for you, Rick, I'm not sure, but how has social media, the NIL era, this transfer portal, and also agent involvement impacted athlete stress?
Well, in keeping with this tricky a metaphor here, it's tricky because I think NIL and social media really affects different parts of the college sports ecosystem much differently. It's probably a very small piece of certain Division I programs, certain sports at Division I programs that are really feeling the pressure of social media. But my daughter playing Division III soccer in the middle of Minnesota, she's not feeling social media pressure. She's not thinking about NIL. And most college athletes play outside of the Division I level. So I think in some ways, I worry sometimes about the discussion of social media because I think it puts the emphasis back on the athletes to somehow do something different, to change their behavior, to get off social media, to not constantly check their sites. And it defers addressing some of the larger issues about what is it that's troubling them in the first place about the very structures and systems of college athletics and higher education. And the same with the NIL, Aaron, is that it's a very small piece of the athlete landscape that is going into the portal that's trying to get this kind of money. And it's important that we understand how it works and operates. But sometimes I think we're using it as a way to distract our attention from what might be more important systemic features.
Thank you, Rick. Katie, I see you nodding. Anybody else want to comment on this question?
I echo Rick. I think we put a lot on athletes thinking that they need to make a change or they should be doing something different. And we put the magnifying glass there instead of really zooming out and looking at the system. For athletes to have maneuverability is a great thing, right? If it's a healthy relationship with the coach and the program supportive and run ethically, athletes aren't going to want to go anywhere, right? Because they're going to feel that sense of belonging and value. And so if the program is doing and operating well, and that's not going to mean it's going to land for everybody, right? Then athletes aren't going to be seeking more and looking elsewhere, but for them to have some flexibility. And I think with social media, we talk to a lot of athletes, especially in Olympic sports where there's not really a focus on them in the mainstream media. They were able to generate a whole new fan base from their social media platforms and draw a crowd in a way that otherwise wouldn't have been able to happen. So, I mean, tricky seems to be kind of the theme of this, but it's tricky, but it's not all good and it's not all bad.
Thank you. And I'm curious on this topic. It occurs to me that there's been some reports, and I don't know how significant they are, but it has seemed to me that some young people, particularly young women, are seeing the social media route as a way to bolster their visibility in the world. And I wonder, does that change the potential mental health challenges that young athletes who are already participating in, this very difficult system to operate in? Does that change the way that they are looking at themselves in terms of their bodies and whatnot?
I
Danielle?
would say in general, it's not exclusive to social media. I mean, comparison, affects, I would say, all of us, but sure, women, I would say, have we're infiltrated with images, whether that's through social media, whether digital content, printed content. I know that that's outdated at this point, but I mean, as a young teen, looking through magazines, like you were comparing yourself to others, back then through that form of media. And so, sure, I think that, a lot of individuals that I see within my practice, females, it's the keeping up with what society has said is quote unquote pretty or acceptable, or how I should look. If I'm a gymnast, this is what the mold should be. And so I think there's a lot of tug of war internally with, am I supposed to be what everyone's telling me to be, or is it okay to be who I am? And so, yeah, I do see that 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 battle internally with a lot of folks who are consuming at high rates a lot of external imagery and going, is that what I'm supposed to be like? I don't look that way, but am I supposed to look that way? And so it has caused an internal struggle. It's just more easily accessible because it's in your hand and it's on social media, but it's always been around. We've always been battling that. So
Absolutely. And having brought that issue up, and I know it was mentioned earlier, there's specific circumstances that some men face, male athletes face. How do those differ between young female athletes and young male athletes? Are there any salient differences that anybody wants to speak to? I think it was mentioned that young male athletes are less likely to seek out mental health resources, or they may not want a male therapist or social worker. Any other distinctions that come to mind? What about athletes of color at predominantly white institutions? Are there any salient differences there in terms of seeking resources?
I would say yes, but it all depends on their sense of belonging and also their sense of, for lack of a better word, who looks like them on staff that they can relate to. If they're more prone to seeing people who look like them in those spaces, they're going to be a lot more open to have those discussions. If it's the opposite, you're going to get them probably not to have a conversation. So it's about understanding the barriers that some of them have to break down, and some of the experience that they've had prior to. But yes, that is reality.
Thank you, Kenyatta.
I'll jump on that too. I feel like what you said, the more they're seeing public figures, the more we're seeing public figures come out saying that getting mental health help is okay. We're seeing more males come out. We're seeing more people of color come out. It's going to feel acceptable for the rest of those athletes to do it as well. We actually work with a former NFL player named Jamil Douglas, and he has a podcast called For the Underdogs, where he discusses mental health and talks to different people within their lives who overcame different obstacles, usually related to mental health. And he's told me how he tries to go back and talk to athletes. He lives here in Arizona, so he goes to ASU a lot. And he played at ASU and talks to individual athletes about their mental health and where they can get help and why it's okay to get help. So I just really think having those role models that can demonstrate, that it's acceptable to reach out within those marginalized populations or ones that are feeling stigma is important.
Thank you, Catherine, for sharing that. And Kenyatta, I'm curious to follow up a little bit. Rick had said earlier that, if everybody was reaching out for mental health resources, that it would not be possible to serve all of them, I should say. And so I wonder, given your comment about certain athletes not wanting to seek out, or maybe being reluctant, I think is what you said, to be seeking out, are there enough mental health professionals who are people of color that can be reached out to in your experience and to your knowledge?
No. No. I think it's a growing field, but I think it's also a stigma within our community. The whole ideal and concept of mental health. One thing that I did want to add with what Catherine was stating a few minutes ago, a lot of times you have student athletes come in and their sport has always been their safe space or their coping mechanism that has overshadowed the mental health scenarios or situations that they have experienced in life. So once they get to this point, especially when you go on the upper side of the Division I, like your P4 institutions, and now everything is coming at you with the money, your status of, are you doing well enough as you should? So all that's hitting them on top of something that they've been just coping with for years, figuring out how to get through it, and now it's coming to a head and they need help.
Mhm.
And who around them do they trust to go to it? Because now you have years of baggage that you have to start pulling out. And do we honestly, at this phase, within the 3.5, 4 years that they have in this space, do we have the staffing? Do we have the time to help them? And are we actually being fair to them? You know, because we're asking so much of them, knowing that there's a lot that we have to unpack. And our job is to help prepare you for that next phase in your life. Do we have the time? Do we have the resources? So I think that's something to, you know, throw back to the general athletic sphere. Like, are we really servicing these students in that area? Because a lot of our students struggle with mental health. Whether we want to agree with it or a lot of us as adults struggle with mental health. And are we going to? Sorry, didn't want to go off on a tangent, but just wanted to really make that point because I don't think we really look at it that way. It's it's about making money. It's no longer the days of we love the entertainment. You've been gifted to do this. Let's go do this. It's about the money. And anything else is next man up.
Thank you, Kenyatta. I appreciate your insight there. Anybody else want to add to that?
I think I would add one thing. The thought that keeps popping into my head as you were talking was how oftentimes for college athletes, what ends up happening is they take the step to get mental health care and they found their way somehow through the system. They found a person they trusted and then get there. And the treatment is about enhancing performance versus tending to their actual mental health need. And that's a really tricky nuance of treatment within college athletics, of the team wants you back and needs you back and you're a key player, but you're grappling with substance use or self-harm. And the focus becomes, how do we get you to stop that so you can show up for your team instead of understanding how come that is present?
Yeah, really interesting point there. Thank you, Katie. And so we haven't yet addressed the topic of suicide, but of course that's in the topic of our panel today, and I do want to get to that. And so the first question I want to ask along those lines is, you know, clearly there are lots of pressures and lots of barriers to accessing resources, but in your experience, what juncture do the pressures faced by college athletes escalate to the point where they might contemplate suicide? Maybe Catherine or Danielle, would one of you like to speak to this?
I think that that is a nuanced question, right? So I don't think that there is a specific point where it's like, and that is linear. That I could say this is what applies to all. It's not. I think everybody has an individual experience, and so a lot of things play into that. Their history, what was childhood going on, like what experiences have they had in the past, what trauma are they bringing into the spaces that they're entering, what past trauma do they carry, and so again, very nuanced and specific to each individual. So I would say not a specific point. It's different for everyone. But if you have an individual who has, I'm not sure if everyone here or that is listening is familiar with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and so someone that has a higher ACE score perhaps comes to college and the pressures in freshman year are the thing that triggers them, or perhaps it's someone that has the model childhood, right? And they get to college and it's a new environment and new ecosystem, and it's like something happens that's incredibly traumatic, and that's the one breaking point. It's not linear, like I shared earlier. And so I think that making sure that we're approaching every single person as an individual, making sure that we are holding space for everyone's experiences, And really, I think the big theme that I keep hearing is like the system, and training, and how do we fix the various systems? And so, really educating coaches on signs and on just changes in behavior, or educating the team on those same types of things. So we're having group discussions and everybody's receiving this information so we can be some level of a support or accountability partner, or say like, hey, this person's acting a little bit different, or seeing the little signs that may not be these huge outwardly, I'm self-harming, or I'm completely isolating. It may not be drastic behaviors. It may just be small things that you're like, let me think on that. But if people aren't educated on those things, you don't know what to do with it. And so I do think that, the larger conversation is education, training, systems. How do we really fix those areas so that people can start speaking up and holding space for others, and then connecting them to resources, the appropriate resources. We've talked a lot about going somewhere and it's about performance. Like, that's not what an individual needs in those moments. We're not looking at performance. It is your overall mental health and well-being. And so how do you make sure you're connecting these athletes to the right specialty or the right individual to support their mental well-being versus their performance?
Thank you very much. And that leads into the next question I was going to ask anyway, which is, what guidance can mental health professionals offer regarding effective interventions for supporting college athletes' mental well-being? Are there others beyond what Danielle has just said that others would like to share?
What we keep hearing, Aaron, from the athletes we talk to, from the parents and friends of athletes who have died by suicide, is that these people are very good at hiding things. They've become very adept at hiding physical injury, at hiding emotional injury, at not showing weakness. And so it's really hard to see the signs, because sometimes there just are no signs. Or if there are signs, they've become so good at hiding them that no one's going to see them. So parent after parent and friend after friend saying, I was best friends with this person. I didn't see a thing. I'm with this person every day. I didn't see a thing. And if that's the case, if it's hidden like that, I think it leaves us no choice but to, try to address whatever it is that's the underlying cause of the anxiety and the stress and the suicidal ideation in the first place. And that means challenging existing organizational and institutional structures. And that's a tall order, as Kenyatta was saying. There's a lot at stake here if you start shaking up the apple cart and asking people to actually do college sports and do higher education differently if they really want to impact change in the in the long run.
Thank you, Rick. Katie?
I think the only thing I would add is, while not a coach, I do have a lot of empathy for coaches, because they have so many things on their plate and they're trying to manage all these things, some doing it better than others. And there's certainly a bell curve, right? And we're seeing stories that are well outside of that, and that is never okay. But for these that are within the bell curve, we also need to be providing kind of this template for what athletic departments can be doing, because right now all of them are having to create their own wheel instead of having any type of organizational system that they can be utilizing and implementing and potentially modifying, but they're having to create that from the ground up. And that's a tall order. So if there could be more collaboration and protocol in place, I think that would help and hopefully alleviate something from coaches' plate that would make it easier to then integrate it, hopefully early, because we know early intervention works, right? So we're naming these things before they become kind of this acute symptomology. But I do think it's a doable change, right? Creating a template, I think, we're even in this discussion coming up with that, but could we get that organized enough to be able to have it be a system that coaches or athletic departments could easily implement? Instead of like, just know your athlete and pay attention, and mental health can get so abstract. For those of us in mental health, right, we know kind of those layers and what those different shades can be. Not always, right? You can always miss something, but coaches aren't mental health providers, and they shouldn't be. So how can we provide them with a template that could make it user friendly in that way?
Yeah, and to follow up on that, Katie, and maybe this is a question for everybody, but of course, coaches play a really significant role, and they have the most proximal relationship to athletes on a day-to-day basis. But of course, there's athletic directors as well, and other professionals at the university. There's parents as well. I mean, what would you recommend to people in other positions when it comes to supporting athletes' mental well-being?
I mean, I could go on forever, but I promise not to take up all the airspace. But one of the things that keeps coming to mind is we reviewed hundreds of, they were mostly D1 coaches contracts because they're all public record. And in the contract, they would have basically itemized what the coach was going to earn if they win this championship or if they place in the division in this place, right? Itemized, like they knew exactly the dollar amount they would get. And then most universities were savvy enough to know they needed to be considering mental health. And so there would be a line in the coach's contract that say, coach will consider athlete well-being or prioritize maybe even. But that was as generous as it got. And there was nothing to quantify that. And yet there's a lot of ways in which we can quantify that, right? Retention rates, injuries, donors, how much are they donating after they leave the program? Are they still engaging in the sport? What's the athlete report, right? There's a lot of ways that we can begin to quantify what the athlete experiences instead of allowing it to continue to be this abstract thing that's get to be subjective. We need to make that more objective and tangible so that there is a level of accountability.
Thank
in
you.
my opinion.
Thank you, Katie. So back to the question of suicidal ideation, what do you recommend someone do if they suspect an athlete is in that position? I know Rick has mentioned it may not be always easily visible, but if you do have that suspicion, what would you recommend an athletic director or a coach or some other professional at a university do?
This is a question I get a lot. We work with different universities, K through 12 schools, different NGBs, and the number one question we get, I would say, is probably how can we educate our coaches in responding to disclosures of abuse, disclosures of mental health concerns, disclosures of suicidal ideation, and it's something that obviously is not a piece of education that's going out to all these different groups that work with them. And there's kind of the suicidal evaluation where you're looking at, do you have a motive? Do you have means? But that's not necessarily the coach's job, to do a clinical evaluation of the athlete when they come to them with those problems. So I really think, we were talking about education and systems needed within the whole mental health problem within athletes. And there's those two prongs. There's prevention education for the coaches, and then there's also crisis intervention education. So what resources can they provide for people that are concrete? What referrals can they give them? How can they respond to that specific disclosure? How can they help them and refer them to the correct person? It's not a sports psychologist, it is a counselor, and it's a counselor who is specifically familiar with athlete concerns. I was going to mention this earlier, but not every counselor knows what athletes go through. There's specific athlete issues. There's, that crisis, identity and retirement. There is all of those pressures that we've already discussed. And a counselor who's never been in the sports world or never been an athlete might not necessarily be able to respond to it the way a counselor who does know sports is. So just knowing very specific resources that can be handed out is really important.
Thank you, Catherine. And I know it's been mentioned already that structural change is necessary. Given that within the context of particularly big time Division I, Power Four, where the money is huge, in the interim between now and the time where that structural change does come, how can athletes improve their stress management and better balance their academic pursuits, their athletics, their different forms of identity, whether it's athletic identity or otherwise? I see smiles. I like to see smiles. Does that mean you want to answer the question? I see Kenyatta. I see Katie. Catherine, you're smiling. Anybody want to chime in there?
I mean, I'll say a tidbit. That's like the $1 million question, right? And I have little kids. My oldest is 9, then have twin 6-year-olds. And I'm like, wow, like what is going on with the sports system? Like what is being expected of my 9-year-old, right? He's fourth
Yes.
grade, he's a baby. Like shouldn't even know what he really loves yet. He just should be in it, right? But yet he's having to commit to a spring sports team in September. I mean, I love sport. I love sports. So I think there's a lot of goodness there, but like the whole system needs a little bit of a flip on its head in that sense, right? Of we're setting that tone at 9 years old and there's never a break. There's never a rest where there's very little opportunity for an athlete to connect to themselves and evaluate how am I feeling? What am I needing? Is there space or maneuverability? Wow. And then you get to college. And I mean, you said this very early on in this panel, Erin, of they're professional athletes, right? Like there's such a commitment at that point of that's stifling, and yet they're still so young, right? Like frontal brain development still hasn't like fully come into play yet. So you all, what do you think? What's the answer?
Katie, you've opened the can of worms. There it goes. All right. So one of the things we're trying to do in this documentary is not just focus on college sports, but to look at the youth sports system too. Because kids get to college, they're already halfway up the wall, right? They've been doing exactly as your kids are doing. They're specializing at a younger and younger ages. They have year-round play. There's pressure. They're traveling all over the country for national championships. And the ones who do that, the ones who specialize, are the ones that get hurt the soonest, both physically and mentally. So in order to fix the college sports system, we've got to fix the youth sports system. And that's a $18-19 billion industry. Now we're running into what Kenyatta was talking about before. There's a lot of people who have a vested interest right now in keeping the systems the way they are. They benefit from them. And unfortunately, it's the young kids and you're right, they're 20, they're 21. They're not babies, but they're closer to that than where I am. And so they're not. Yeah, it's pretty complicated. Thanks for opening that Pandora's box.
Yeah, to add to that,
Yeah, Daniel.
I would say, you know, I connect so much to that, Katie, because I also have young children and it's wild. And I often wonder, the education piece for parents as well. Like, how do we get into youth athletics and speak to and educate parents along with the actual system and organization? But I think that it's not just common knowledge for parents to really understand and know all of this and how this is impacting their child and brain development. I mean, all of it. There's so much. And so really starting with that piece too of talking through what are the opportunities for us to get in front of parents of kids enrolled in these different clubs and the pressures that are put on them and talk through what that can do and how do you as a parent advocate and protect your child, because I see everyone has a private coach now at 9 years old, 8 years. It's laughable. I'm like, a private, and the investment that we're putting that parents are putting in, and it's like, well, this kid over here is doing all of these things and they're producing great results at 8 years old, and so I need to do that for my kid. And it's like we're going to band together and we're going to continue to promote this way of being and how we're operating while harming the child. And so, like Rick said, by the time they get to college, it's like they've been doing this for 10 years. They've been having these types of pressures put on them. And so I do think there's so much room for improvement in youth sports, but also with educating parents, educating the different organizations and systems and the parents within those systems and organizations.
Thank you very much. It does occur to me that as youth sports has become more professionalized, as you've all been mentioning, and by the way, the Project Play folks at the Aspen Institute do great work on this topic for those of you who are looking for more resources there. But as it becomes more professionalized, I suspect that if athletes are engaging with professional mental health professionals, they're more likely to be engaging with the sports psychologists, I would suspect. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. almost across the board. Any kind of intervention at that level is performance-based,
Right.
not mental health-based.
So they're, if that's the case, Rick, then they're not building any kind of knowledge of that world before they become college athletes.
Absolutely, that's correct. And the parents that you're talking about, I was never one of those parents, but they're around and I watch them and I interview them and I talk to them all the time. And they're always comparing the value of their parenting to how many products they can provide their children and how many opportunities they can provide their children. It keeps coming back to that over and over again. They judge themselves by
Yep.
how well they provide for their kids. They're not thinking their kids are vulnerable in this way. They're thinking they're just kids. They think they're having fun. They say that it's what the kids want to do, when oftentimes it's really what the parents want to do. So yeah, Aaron, it's nothing. Their mental health is not on the mind of parents, I think, in today's youth sports world. It's all about performance. It's all about getting the scholarship. It's all about getting to that showcase tournament. And after that, we'll see what happens.
Right, right. Catherine, I'd like to come to you because I've been remiss in not talking more about the athlete hotline, the Courage First athlete hotline that you're running, and I'd like to just understand a little bit more about what that experience looks like from start to finish. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a call, text, chat line, just like any other line. And we're under the National Child Abuse Hotline, which Danielle runs, but it's a partnership with the Foundation for Global Sports Development. So it's totally independent, and anyone who hears about it can reach out by call, text, or chat, and they will reach a counselor who will provide emotional support. They can provide crisis intervention. There's a large database of different resources, either localized or national, or even we get international outreach as well that they can provide. And it's really just a safe space where the athlete or coach or parent can disclose as much as they want, or they don't have to. And the counselor is going to give them that, that freedom to discuss whatever they want to discuss. So yeah, it's just that soft landing and that independent, confidential place. It's not a reporting line. I think sometimes, the difference between a hotline and a helpline can be confusing. A helpline in general is there for emotional support, but they're not going to report. They are mandated reporters, but as with almost every confidential line, you're not going to get enough identifying information to be able to make a mandated report. So really, it's a specific helpline for athlete issues, and these staff are safe sport trained. They were trained by Dr. Ashley Sterling out of University of Toronto, who does a large body of research in athlete abuse, and Dr. Emma Kavanagh in the UK, who she's a sports psychologist, but she also concentrates on mental health in her sports psychology practice. So just really specialized. And I think, like I was saying before, whether you reach out to the helpline or you try to find a counselor who's specialized in sports, I think that's just really important to be able to have there. So yeah, I mean, the experience is hopefully that they'll feel supported, not just in a kind of a general mental health capacity, but also in an understanding that there is a person who really understands the athlete experience on the other side.
Thank you so much. And, it does occur to me that this may be a difficult question to answer. Maybe there is no right answer here, but is there a best first place to go to for somebody who's struggling, given the fact that there's different professionals available to them? Does anybody have an opinion? I imagine it's case by case. But, I did want to open it up just in case somebody's saying, I'm having issues and I want to talk to somebody, but I don't know who to talk to. Would anybody recommend a particular place to go?
I would say it would depend on severity. So if there's a level of acuity, I think calling Catherine's place and being able to go to some of the hotline or emergency services, like if there's any kind of suicidality or threat to self, use emergency services. If you're looking for more ongoing care, I think it's important, and we get this call a lot, that clinicians are licensed in their state. So I live in Oregon. And if a student athlete lives in Tennessee, I'm not able to work with them because I'm only licensed in Oregon. And so finding somebody who's in your state that feels like a good match, and that can be really hard. And then you add in things like, are you going to pay out of pocket? Are you going to go through your insurance? If you're going through insurance, who's covered in your insurance, under your insurance? That can all be really tricky. If it's not something that's accessible through your school, right? Or at your college athletic department, finding the right place can be hard. If there's a safety concern, people should always go to the emergency room. Go to an emergency service, and an emergency room is in every community or most all communities. And so going to the highest level of care in those crisis situations, I always tell people to utilize. And then you can take more time if there's something that's less acute.
I'll say
Thank you.
too, not everyone knows about 988, the National Suicide Hotline. It's, I think probably everyone here or everyone even close to the profession does know about it, but I am quite surprised that I find a lot of people who have never heard of it before. And that is, a great first step for anyone experiencing any sort of extreme suicidal ideation or who is worried about suicide concerns in others. So just spreading 988 across the land is really, really important right now.
Thank you so much. This leads into a question from our audience here. Julie Swartz writes, has anyone considered using the employee assistance professionals model that is very successful in the US? As athletes are transitioning to EAPs, can the university EAP serve in this role? Anybody like to answer that question?
I guess, Julie, I have a clarifying question of understanding. I'm thinking about an EAP from an insurance model. I'm not sure if that's what she's intending with this question, but there's like maybe 5 sessions that you get through this EAP. And so thinking of if an athletic department could serve as that, I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yeah, Julie, go ahead and type in your answer in the Q&A as well, and I'll follow up. Let me move on now to Christine's question. Christine Caswell, this is what type of training can we promote for coaches? A lot of the anxiety and fears being discussed relate to coaching teams. My D1 athletes have had horror stories over the years. My own son is a sophomore football kicker, and because he entered the transfer portal, he said once he returned to school this week, the other players have been ignoring him and throwing shade at him. He knows this stems from his ST coach, and I'm not sure what ST stands for. As my son said last year, the coach told them to not pay any mind nor speak to players who left the team. It's all immature behavior, but coaches are often at fault. And this is Division III. Anybody want to tackle that one?
There's a number of programs out there that are looking to educate coaches. There's the Positive Coaching Alliance. The Army of Survivors has a compassionate coach program. Obviously, the U.S. Center for Safe Sport has some different education. So I think, it's going to be based on financial means since most of them are fee-based education programs. But there are a number out there that if a school is able to do them, and some of them are grant funded too, they just need to be found. And I think that's a huge problem as well, is a lot of different organizations are, I think, really have good intentions in trying to make these programs and make them widely available, but finding them can be hard. It might be a very deep dive Google search to be able to locate it, see if it's appropriate for your population, and then also if it can be implemented financially or otherwise.
Thank you. Yeah, let's see. Julie has written back and says, no, an EAP is an assessment and referral system. It is a way for employees to receive either short-term assistance or be assessed and referred to experts in their area of struggle, for example, addiction, anxiety, mental health disease. Anybody want to follow up on that?
Likewise with Katie, I'm familiar with, employee assistant programs, through insurance that you get X amount of sessions per issue. But I wouldn't be able to speak further into, what she is referring to.
That's okay. Anybody else? Let's move on then. I want to ask about NILs again, because Joan is interested in the extra stress that NIL might be putting on student athletes. Is there Anybody who wants to follow up on that? That, of course, is a major change in just the last few years. So I do wonder if anybody's seen any changes in their practices.
Well,
I will say, oh, go ahead, Rick.
No, because I don't have a practice, so I don't see it in my practice. I see things in the classroom, and I see things by talking to athletes. And again, at this kind, I'm at a sort of low level FBS Division I school, where the NIL stuff really hasn't taken hold very much. There's men's basketball players and maybe a few women's basketball players. I was interviewing a runner the other day, Katie, who said that she got an offer to get like a gift card if she did something for some local business. And that's about the size of NIL at probably 95% of the schools. But I think at those schools where it's a big deal, it's a big deal. I mean, it's the first and foremost thing on their mind. And if not the first and foremost, it's heavily on their mind. They're going where the money is because they're thinking professionally anyway. So why wait 4 or 3 years to start trying to get the best deal you can? Your lifespan as an athlete is short, so you want to try to maximize your revenue stream as quickly as you can. But when we have that NIL discussion, I think we need to keep in mind that it's a small group of really elite athletes at elite schools.
Danielle, would you like to add?
Yeah, I would just say, in my practice and my experience, it's definitely added some layers. And so now navigating big for a small percentage, but nonetheless for that percentage, some big money. And making real adult decisions with not a fully developed brain, coming into this, in this emerging adulthood stage of life. And it's like, you're enamored by the shiny thing, right? And it's like, ooh, that's great, but it may not be healthy. And then there's also the layer of, relationships and how that the money complicates relationships, and how are your parents supporting you through that? Are they also going with the money, And so that complicates the dynamics between the athlete and the parent as well. And so what type of support systems do they have in place, and are they healthy, and how are they nurturing the athlete and guiding them through these, discussions and navigating these systems that are they're adult systems. And kids, granted 18 years old, you're technically an adult, but kids nonetheless are engaging in these systems with these professionals, with agents, so on and so forth. And so having a really healthy system around you is crucial. Otherwise, it's so easy for parents and athletes and friends and significant others and things to get lost in it, to get lost in the shiny things, and the money. And so that's, I would just say, encouraging people to have really solid support systems is so crucial as you enter into these conversations and systems.
Thank you. And that leads us to another question from the audience, from Donna Lopiano, who says, can you give examples of how to regarding knowing your athlete better, maybe creating intentional spaces for sharing anxiety? Is there a keep it simple approach that doesn't require access to a mental health professional? Again, remembering, as you all said, that there's more demand for mental health services than there is supply.
I honestly think it depends on the sport. Smaller sports, you do see that dynamic. Your larger sports, probably not so, unless it's happening within their position group or their event group. But I do think that is a great opportunity to have that space. And I think it also build a better relationship with the student athletes and their particular coaches, so that they're understanding them more and knowing how maybe some words that they may say may be triggering to the student athletes. So that'll help the coaches actually learn and train them in a way to respond to the student athletes or coach them differently based off of some information that may be shared within those small group settings.
Thank you, Kenyatta. What about Has anybody looked at, this comes from Darlene Kluka, who says, has anyone looked at white athletes at historically black colleges and universities? Anybody want to answer that? Okay, we'll get back to you on that, Darlene. And Andy Duncan writes, as a faculty member, not a coach, I wonder what specific ways faculty members can do their part to help their student athletes' mental health.
All right, I'll go
Rick,
for that
would you
one.
like to take that one? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's in my wheelhouse. One of the things I was going to mention before, and it's related to a kind of parallel research project I've been on, is every school in the NCAA has a faculty athletic representative, and it is one of the great untapped resources that we have. Too often schools will select someone outside, the faculty won't select this person, either athletic administration or academic administration will select them, and too often they will select them for reasons that have nothing to do with athlete well-being. It's more as a sort of a propaganda tool to make sure that everyone knows how high the athlete GPAs are and whatnot. But if that position was truly put back into the hands of the faculty, and the faculty could select somebody for that position as a sort of watchdog, someone who's independent of athletics, that, as when we talked before about that first line of where you go, you could go to this person who could be trained, and then they could direct you to a more useful place. But they could be that kind of ombuds person at the level, independent, completely confidential, completely with the athlete's well-being in mind. And that's a way, if athletes can start pushing the envelope and have their senates and governance bodies take back control of the faculty athletic representative position, I think that's something substantive. I think that could work across 1,200 schools if it's done correctly.
Thank you, Rick. All right, I want to ask one more question from Darlene. She says, what about the student athlete's desires to gain an undergraduate degree at a quality institution? Is this concept dead in the era of NIL? Anybody want to answer that one?
I think it's going back to what Rick alluded to earlier. The amount of student athletes who have access to the high dollar NIL deals is very, very small. So in the grand scheme of things, yes, that is the pursuit, to come to get a college degree. But what's always commercialized are these big NIL deals. That's probably only, I wouldn't even say 10%, probably 5% of our student athlete population overall. But yes, that is, yes. And I will also venture to say that's the only lasting thing that the NCAA can hold on to as far as keeping student athletes working towards something other than something that's monetary. That's the only thing that has not been tapped or tampered with as of yet. They still have academic eligibility qualifications that they have to meet every single year.
Thank you, Kenyatta. This question comes from Ted Hartwell. It says, any thoughts on the role of increased pressures brought about by the rapid legalization of sports wagering across the United States, particularly in-game wagering on individual athletes' stats? Seeing your name associated with an over-under expectation in stats associated with your individual performance and the resulting increased harassment from quote-unquote fans who are disappointed in the outcome of their bets can't be a positive thing for the student athletes. So I suppose that's more of a comment than a question, but would anybody like to respond to the comment? Anybody notice anything with sports wagering, sports
Look, from
gambling?
what I've seen and heard and learned and read about, this is an issue of college students right now. It's,
Mhm.
there's an athlete angle to it, but college students are placed, it's so easy for them to place bets. A record percentage of them are now in debt and facing financial problems because of this. It's a big issue. And I think again, I thought in the New York Times that the biggest advertisers now for Super Bowls and other big games are these online betting platforms, and that's pretty enticing if you're 18 or 19 and you just have to press a button and you can place a wager on an over under or something ridiculous. How many footsteps is the quarterback going to take before they throw the ball? You can wager on anything right now.
Absolutely. And then here is a question from Dimitra Ziarli, I think. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that right. As a former international student athlete and a PhD candidate, I'm wondering if there is any increase in awareness or increase in the focus towards international student athletes and how to support them better on and off the court or field. I'd like to think that clients are more likely to reach out for help or even stay in therapy if they feel that their therapist can relate to them, which goes back to the who in the institution is hiring and with what kind of cultural background and expertise in the clinical field, while also keeping in mind that the international student athlete experience is unique compared to the experience of a citizen or permanent resident student athlete. Or are there at least statistical reports specifically for this vulnerable population? Is this something that anyone would like to answer? I think this may be one that we have to follow up on.
I can refer to some research that's going on right now on this topic. We'll take care of it later.
Very good. Thank you very much, Rick. Donna Lopiano asks another question. What percentage of a coach's time should be spent on non-sport inquiry or activity? Would such a concept be a measuring stick for prevention, demonstrating caring about personal development rather than sport success? Let's say it's 10% of their time. Can you paint a picture of what this time might look like to a coach? Any takers on this one? Katie, I see you reaching for your mute button.
I mean, I'll jump in. I actually don't have a great answer just because it's so, I mean, I will say what I don't want to do for coaches is I don't want to coaching is a creative process, right? And what can make a great coach is their own tactics for how they're engaging with the athletes and how they structure workouts and how they design the season. There's such an individual piece to that. And so we want to continue to allow them to have this like creative liberty with this framework of I only, and this is where my scope is limited, of I am from a mental health standpoint. And I know there's a shortage of mental health integration and tools to be able to implement into systems, but I don't feel comfortable saying what percentage that should be, other than like, I'd like to see it be more of a percentage than what we're currently seeing overall, but that's a little abstract and not super tangible. As a coach, you kind of want, like, I think about percentages like a pie chart, and an athlete has to do this too, right? One only has 100%. When people are like, you give it 150%, I'm like, literally nobody has that to give, right? We have 100%, and that includes like sleeping and eating. And so how are they going to structure it? I think a sliver of that pie needs to be allotted to mental health and mental well-being of an athlete, but is that 10%? Is it 12%? Is it 20%? I think there's variability there.
Thank you, Katie. Alex Diaz writes, do coaches' contracts include mandating the attendance of mental wellness webinars? If not, shouldn't it be the case that they are? I'm not sure if this was answered earlier, but anybody like to respond to that?
I honestly don't think they are. And back to what Katie shared earlier, if it is, it's a very small percentage, and it's not detailed within their contracts either. So yes, no, it hasn't really been explored from that in-depthness.
It does seem that part of the problem in accessing mental health care at some of these places, particularly the big time universities where athletes have enormous pressure on them, it does seem to me that this discussion is bringing out the fact that coaches ought to be that first line of defense, so to speak, rather than a bigger part of the problem. And Michael Henry writes, do colleges ever refer coaches, athletes, and parents to external providers for mental health support? Do athletic departments ever provide referral lists of external providers who work with athletes, parents, coaches? I'm an LMFT in California, and I work with athletes and parents when they come my way. They are a part of the population I serve. Anybody aware of that? Maybe there are legal restrictions that universities face towards that.
I mean, a simple answer, and I'm sure there's more complexity, is athletic departments do refer out to the community. And hopefully, based off this conversation, right, if we know the clinicians that are housed in the athletic department cannot serve all of the needs. And what we know is that 10% of athletes with known mental health conditions are accessing care. And the system's already tapped. And so universities have to be referring out. It's important that they have kind of a list of who are the local and licensed and experienced and specialized clinicians that they can be referring out to, but they absolutely can refer out and do.
And following up on that, Katie, is there a particular way that you'd recommend an LMFT like that recommend their services, or to a university? Is there a particular person in universities that they ought to reach out to get on that
It
list?
could be like a good little side hustle though. If you're in California, you could reach out to the California schools and just work your way through the athletic department. I mean, I think that's probably part of the problem, right? Is there isn't this streamlined system of who is the best point person within an athletic department, but it could be kind of a fun task. And maybe at the next panel, they could report back, like if they found a consistent person that was generally the most likely to respond. No, I'd start with somebody in the athletic department office, though, rather than going to each individual coach, unless you have heard on the news that that coach is more open to mental health conversations or values it more, then maybe that person would be the best point of contact. But I start with some just like cold calling or cold emails.
Okay, thank you. And Brian DiNapoli writes, given the significant impact drug and alcohol abuse can have on mental health, what efforts or initiatives are in place to help student athletes prevent substance abuse and maintain their overall well-being? I think I heard one of you speaking about how that can sometimes be a masking behavior and prevent mental health resources from being accessed as well. Are universities doing enough along these lines, I suppose, is another way of asking that question. Kenyatta, I see you smiling. I'm not going to call on you unless you press your mute button.
No, I'll just say they can do more. A lot more can be done within this area.
Any particular recommendations you would have?
Not at this moment, no.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I think that there's always an opportunity for prevention education and then also intervention, like connecting to intervention. So it's tackling it from both sides. I think that if you can approach it from both sides and have a well-rounded network of education, but also providers to connect people to, in time of need, then that can be helpful as well.
I want to read a question from Emily Record, I think, she says, hi, thank you all for having this webinar. I coach at a D2 institution with limited resources, especially when it comes to mental health. We try really hard to talk about it with the team, and I encourage all my assistants to openly talk about therapy as they're comfortable, obviously, so we can try to normalize it more. And she goes on to say, what are some other ways that we can help our players feel comfortable talking to professionals when they need it? Anybody like to speak to that? I mean, it would seem that there's so many barriers getting in the way of athletes reaching out for resources. What are some ways that coaches and other adults can help people feel more comfortable with doing that?
I think maybe what coaches and athletic administrators can do is really create a safe space for students to do this on their own with groups like, say, Morgan's Message, which many of us have heard of, and our chapters are all over the country at both colleges and high schools. And it takes a little while. From what we've found is that there's a startup and it gets slowly, but once they get these chapters established, it becomes more, it reduces the stigma, right? And once you reduce the stigma, you can address some of the other things. But there's been opposition to groups like that on some campuses, and that because it's kind of subcontracting out what the athletic program think they should be doing internally, and sometimes it just can't be done internally, or it needs to be done by the athletes themselves.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
think peer-to-peer outreach and role modeling is really a great way to be able to normalize that outreach for mental health. I know there's organizations like the Hidden Opponent where they have campus captains that they work on different campuses to activate different mental health events and really promote the normalization of getting mental health help. So I think it's great that we have these organizations now that are able to activate that in a widespread capacity and utilize the peers rather than having the coaches have to try to make a safe space, especially like was mentioned before. It might be the coach's pressure or the way the coach is coaching that is causing the mental health in the first place.
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. And Catherine McAdoo says, do you see athletic departments utilizing any alternative resources, for example, mindfulness coaches or other specialized professionals to address mental health outside of traditional therapy? Is this something that's getting some traction?
I've seen a few sports that have utilized that on their staffs, and it has been very helpful. So yes, I don't know how large scale this is, but I have seen it. I have seen it utilized.
Anyone else? Let's see, there's one other question I wanted to get to here. It's about accountability. This comes from Demetra as well. Since we're starting to care more about mental health in this space, is there anything in place systematically to keep coaches accountable in terms of making sure that they care about the right things and pay attention to the athlete's mental health and overall well-being? Any approaches towards that end that people can think of?
I mean, not to be Debbie Downer, but no. Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's like, we need it. We really need it. And we all need to band together to help create it. I think it's going to take a collective and everybody working together to create some of these systems to be able to get them implemented. But no, there are, I mean, maybe this is somewhat my jaded perspective, but any systems of accountability is very, very minimal.
Thank you, Katie.
Well, Katie, you were clear before from what you were talking about that the accountability has to do with everything except this, except perhaps in a performative way, right? That accountability is wins and conference championships and MVPs, and that's how you're accountable. And that's how you're occupationally mobile, right? If you're a coach, you're not going to be judged by how well adjusted your players are when they leave the program. You're going to be judged by how many all conference players you created, as though, you know, it's the coach that did it. So you can be Debbie Downer. That's okay.
What about recommendations for folks that are outside of this system? We may have some in the audience who are not, active in universities as instructors or professors or coaches or athletic directors. Maybe there are just people out in the audience who want to make a difference, want to help this situation somehow. Do any of you have recommendations for what they would do? I know, Catherine, you had mentioned 988. Are there other, of course, your hotline? Are there other resources that all lay people should just know in case that they have the opportunity to help somebody?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of resources out there. Kind of like I said, you kind of have to dig and find them. They're not necessarily right in front of your face there, unless they're one of those national hotlines like 988 or the National Domestic Violence Hotline. So you have to find them, and they're usually very specific to maybe K through 12 schools, to a specific county, to national governing bodies who have implemented different programs within them. Universities are usually pretty insular and have their own programs. We're talking about outside of universities, but a lot of these different sports, different governing bodies, different schools and districts are super insular and aren't accessing or looking for any resources outside. But kind of like I said, if you're looking for like prevention, there's the Positive Coaching Alliance, there's the Compassionate Coach Program, there's Spot a Spider for abuse. If you're looking for crisis intervention, there's what, like we all talked about, there's those barriers, but there is, the different provider lists where approved different sports providers can be found within different locations. And if you have insurance or if you have the means to use you do self-pay, those can work for you. I just think, it really requires like a deep dive search into what's available in your area, what's financially possible, and then what's going to be appropriate for your population. We have on the helpline website, there's a resource page, and it is something people can access. And so, and I'm also happy if you'd like to reach out to me personally to pass on very specific resources within your area or for any specific need. We have a huge database, so I don't want to go through and list every resource that
Yes, we will be sending out follow-up notes here, and I really appreciate you making that offer,
Yeah.
Catherine. And I really appreciate all of you. We're coming up on time now. It's coming to a close, but I just want to thank all of our panelists for your time and your insights. Catherine Beach, National Program Manager, Courage First Athlete Helpline. Thank you so much. Dr. Rick Eckstein, Professor of Sociology, Villanova University, thank you very much. Danielle Saragusa, LCSW Executive Director of the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, thank you as well. Katie Steele, Executive Director of the Athletes Mental Health Foundation, thank you. And Kenyatta Walker, Associate Director of the Cox Communication Academic Center for Student Athletes at the Louisiana State University. And to all of our attendees, thank you as well for being here today. We really appreciate it. There will be follow-up notes coming your way, as with all of our webinars. And we really hope you look through those and reach out to us if you have any further questions. We're happy to answer them. This has been a really great opportunity to explore the different mental health challenges that we see in college athletics, and including suicide and suicidal ideation. And I really hope that this panel will benefit some people who are struggling out there. So I want to thank all of you so much again. Does anybody want to have the last word? Anybody want to say one last thing? We have a couple minutes. I see a couple smiles. I see Katie smiling, Catherine smiling, Kenyatta, I think you're smiling. Danielle
I
is
just want to
definitely
say
smiling.
thank you, for creating this space for us to have this conversation. I think that it's important, and I hope that we continue to talk about this, because if we don't, it does fall to the wayside, and we aren't able to make the necessary changes within the system that need to be changed. And so, just continue the conversation, keep talking about it, make noise.
Absolutely. I love that. And we will. That's what we do here at the Drake Group. And we really appreciate all of you continuing to make the noise that you make in all of your work. So please keep it up. And that will end our webinar for the day. We thank you again for being here. Hope everybody has a great rest of their day. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.